So we're in part 1, chapter 4, paragraph 7. Ramchal now has an extraordinary presentation. It's really based on Maimonides and the laws of character traits, Hilchos Deos. It's almost, the idea is the same idea. It's almost word for word. And what he says is this. All of man's activities are divided into two categories. One of them is that you should do what you're commanded to do. There's a mitzvah to do it, and you do it. And the other is necessities. So at the outset, what we hear, this is going to change later, but what we hear is necessities aren't commanded. The world is divided into two types of activities. Commands, where God says, I want you to do this, put on tefillin, give charity, pursue justice, don't eat bacon cheeseburgers, and so forth and so on. Right? And then, you're going to eat, you're going to have to work, you're going to preserve your health, you're going to have to go to doctors, there are things that you need, and then for those things, you'll have to work or get resources and get information, and so forth and so on. So your life is divided into two types of activities. Now, when you look at the first category, when you talk about the purpose of keeping a mitzvah, what is the point of keeping a mitzvah? What does it accomplish? So one of them is obedience. The Creator said that this is what you should do, and you take for yourself His will as your will, and you do what He wants you to do. But now, that submitting to the divine will has two parts. One is that he does the action that God told him to do. As I said, put on tefillin, eat matzah, give charity, and so forth and so on. Secondly, the action that God told him to do creates a certain perfection in the person who's doing it, in the agent. And creating that perfection is something that God wants him to do. So he's fulfilling God's will in two different ways. Now, this isn't quite obvious, because if someone tells you, if you do this, you'll improve your physical coordination and physical strength. You say, well, that's good, It's good to be coordinated, it's good to be strong, right? And then somebody says, by the way, God wants you to be strong and coordinated. So you say, oh, that's nice. That's nice. Of course, even if he didn't, since it's important to be strong and coordinated, I would do it anyway. But it's nice to know that God's interested in my health. What the Ramchal is telling us is that's not the appropriate attitude. The appropriate attitude is, I'm here to do what He wants me to do. If He had no interest in my health, I wouldn't have any interest in my health either. My interest is only to do what He wants me to do. So, when I look at this action, and I say, God commanded me to do this action, I also notice that this action produces some kind of good result for me. That good result by itself shouldn't motivate me. I should say, God told me to do this. When I do this, I get this good result, but if God doesn't tell me to do it, I'm not interested in it. I'll do it because He told me to do it, but the outcome that creates a certain perfection in me, I'm totally neutral on that. But what you have to know is that God wants you to become as perfect as you can. This goes all the way back to the second chapters. Because by becoming as perfect as you can, you enjoy more of God's good. And the whole purpose of the project is that God should do good, provide good, benefit. So when you do the mitzvah, you're fulfilling God's will in two different ways. One is because he told you to do the action, and the second is the consequence of the action is going to create a certain perfection for you, and God wants you to have that perfection, and that's why you go after that perfection. Let me illustrate the logic here with a famous problem that Nefesh HaChaim gives this type of answer to. You know, we are promised reward and punishment for what we do. Reward and punishment motivate a person. God put the reward and punishment in place as a motivation. If a person does a mitzvah just because he knows that when he does the mitzvah, he'll earn a reward, and if he doesn't do the mitzvah, he's going to be punished, so by doing the mitzvah, he gets the reward and avoids the punishment. If that's his sole motivation, he gets credit. He gets credit. He did the mitzvah, and he'll be rewarded for it. But a higher service, a greater service, is where a person does it without concern for a reward. He does it lishmo, which means roughly, well, I'll tell you what it means. Quote the Rambam now. Lishmo means you do it out of love of the master who commanded it. When people say lishmo means for its own sake, that's ambiguous and dreadfully misleading. Why are you learning Torah? It's geschmack. It's clever logic. It requires a lot of intellectual effort. The friendships you build in the Beis Medrash are real friendships, and you're sharpening your mind. It's really good. We had one guy come in here maybe 20 years ago. He said, I want to learn Gemara, just Gemara, not putting on tefillin, not getting me kosher. I want to learn Gemara. Why is that? Because I was told that Gemara sharpens your mind. My goal is that by the time I'm 35 to have $1 million. And to do that, you got to have a sharp mind. And the Gemara gives you a sharp mind. So I want to learn Gemara so that I can earn $1 million. We said, okay, we don't turn people away. In the middle of his second year, he began to feel that there was something more to it than getting the way to earn $1 million. So when a person does it because of reward and punishment, he's doing the mitzvah and he'll get reward for it. But that's childish. It's immature. When you come to appreciate that God's will is more important, more valid, more valuable, more significant than anything else, and you say, this is my chance to do something that's really important, then you're doing it in a immature fashion. So, having come this far, when you look at a person who says, I'm keeping the mitzvahs to get into the world to come, that's where all the reward is, and that's my purpose. To do it in order to get in the world to come, you think, well, that's, an 11-year-old. But you're 26. Shouldn't you outgrow that? Shouldn't you get to the point where you do it because it's right, because it's good, because it's great, and so forth and so on? The Nefesh HaChaim said, not necessarily. Not necessarily, because suppose I ask him, you're doing the mitzvah in order to get into Olam Haba, to the world to come. Why do you want to get into the world to come? And suppose he says, I want to get into the world to come because that's where God wants me to be. He wants me there. Not because it's the world's greatest possible enjoyment forever. No, He wants me there. And since He wants me there, I want to get there. Then he's taken what looks like a selfish reward and turned it into a service of God. It's a very subtle point, Fidati, according to my opinion. Here too, you're saying the same thing. You look at this and you say, this will it'll give me better self-control. It'll give me a focus on high values, doing these mitzvos, right? It'll give me greater sensitivity. All these are important for a person, and they make me into a better person, right? And we're being told that shouldn't be your goal, because that has nothing to do with God. But if you say, God wants me to be more sensitive, God wants me to have more self-control, and I'm working to achieve these improvements in my character because God wants me to have these improvements in my character, then it's appropriate. Because in the end, you're serving God both ways. Somebody's hand was up? No? Okay. Yeah.
And why is it good? Why do something for the service of God? Why is that the reason?
I really hinted at the answer already, but it's a very important point. So let's talk about it in a little more detail. The mitzvos of the Torah can be divided in many ways, in many categories, but one division is this. Some mitzvos are commanded. God says, do X. I'm commanding you to do X. And if you do X, you'll be rewarded. And if you don't, you're going to be punished. Because I'm commanding you to do X. Those are called obligatory mitzvos. In Hebrew, Mitzvah v'oser. Other mitzvos, God says, I'm inviting you. I'm inviting you. And if you do it, you'll be rewarded. But if you don't do it, there's no penalty. I'm just offering you something which is good to do. But if you don't, there's no... In moral theory, this is called supererogation. Supererogation, something which, if you do it, it's good, but if you don't do it, there's no penalty. So now, which action would be superior, more meaningful, more important, deserving of greater reward, more noble, more significant, and so forth and so on? The ones where you're commanded, where there's reward and punishment, or the ones where you're invited, where there's only reward, but no punishment if you don't do it, no penalty. So most people, when they hear the question for the first time, respond that the invitation mitzvah is a higher mitzvah because it's more noble. It shows more of your character and sensitivity. It shows your devotion to high ideals. Whereas a commanded mitzvah is just obedience. He said so, so I do it. That's the natural reaction. But the Jewish tradition has the opposite position. The commanded mitzvah is more important, and you get a greater reward. The optional mitzvah, the invited mitzvah, is less important and gets a lesser reward. So the question is, why is that so? And several answers are given in the literature. One answer that's given by Tosfos is, you measure the amount of effort that's required to do the mitzvah. What Tosfos said 800 years ago is as modern as tomorrow, and especially speaking to Americans. Tosfos says that when you order somebody to do something, there's resistance. Does that sound familiar, guys? You know, you told me what to do, don't tell me what to do. Don't push me around. You know, I'll lead my own life. Get off my back. Right? Whereas where you're invited and you make your own decision, you make your own commitment, they don't have that resistance. And since in the commanded mitzvah there's more resistance, it's harder to do. And since it's harder to do, you get more reward. That's a very simple, direct explanation. But others explain in the following way. Ask yourself, in which mitzvah is there more of you, and in which mitzvah is there more of God? Let's see. In a commanded mitzvah, I just obey. I obey because he commanded me. In the optional mitzvah, now let's go back over the words I used 3 minutes ago. In the optional mitzvah, it shows my nobility. It shows my attachment to high values. It shows my sensitivity. You hear the word that came in 3 times there? How about my? My ability, my nobility, my sensitivity, my attachment. There's a lot of me in there. There's a lot of me in there. A lot less of God in there. Whereas in the commanded mitzvah, where I have no other option, where I have to be obedient, there's much less of me and much more of God. Which action would be the greater action? The one there's more of God in what I do, or the one there's less of God in what I do? So at this point, I think you should be feeling a little bit uneasy about the initial intuition. Why would it be superior from a religious point of view to have less God in what you do? It doesn't sound exactly right. But now it's more than that. It's that if you commit yourself to God out of the sense that he is infinitely important and I'm a speck, which is quite true, that I'm worth nothing other than as my attachment to God, then God is in the action not only because he commands you and you're obedient, but because you recognize that all you could possibly be is to represent God in the world. That's why it has the greater significance. So this is a direct answer to your question. The reason why it's important to obey God is because God represents the greatest possible achievement, the greatest possible value, the greatest possible meaning, the greatest possible significance. And if this is not a familiar idea, let me give you two analogies which may help you appreciate the idea. These are analogies that come from real history, and they are, I think they speak to the human condition. If you look over the history of the Second World War, especially in the United States, there were people who volunteered for the Army even when they were not eligible for the Army. They were too old, or they had disabilities, or whatever it was. And when asked why they're doing that, they said, we're fighting the Nazis. We have to win. I can't sit on the sidelines when we're fighting the Nazis. I can't sit this one out. It's too important. I have to be there. He could die. Well, if I die, it's worth it. This is what must be done. This is more important than my continuing to live. This isn't about me. It's about it. Its importance swallows up my other concerns. You may have heard that in Washington there's a hospital called the Walter Reed Hospital. It's named after a famous doctor, an army doctor, who discovered that yellow fever is carried by mosquitoes. He told this to people and they didn't believe him. And he knew that if he could convince people that the disease was carried by mosquitoes, they could take steps to drain the swamps and in that way save thousands and thousands of human lives. So in order to demonstrate that what he was saying was true, he infected himself. He did it publicly. He had the mosquito bite him, and it was observed, and he came down with the disease. Now he could have died. But his attitude was, yes, I could die. I'm risking my life. But there are thousands of people dying every year for no reason. And we can stop it. That's more important. So there's a sense of this being so important that anything else that you would do pales in comparison. And that being the case, that's why obeying God becomes the highest possible thing that a human being could do. Of course, in order to get to that point, you have to appreciate the things that I said, that they are in fact true facts about the world. Anyway, so the Ramchal starts off by saying that a mitzvah is done in obedience to God's will on two levels: the actual ma'aseh itself, the action, and also the fact that it creates a perfection in the person because he wants to be perfect. Now he says, what a person does in the world for the sake of his necessities, first of all, he has to do it in a way that satisfies the boundaries that God set for using the world. Because if it doesn't obey those boundaries, then either it will increase his deficiencies or it will it'll cut off an opportunity to create more perfection for himself. So he can't, it's coming to be Pesach. Matzahs are very expensive, and I'm short. And George's wallet, Ruvain's wallet, is sitting on the table, and there's nobody here. There's my matzah money! No, sorry. Better do without matzahs. Don't steal the money to buy the matzahs. So that's using the world in such a way that will violate God's boundary, and that action of stealing the wallet will injure your ability to connect to God, to develop perfection, and avoid deficiencies. Now, for example, let's take your physical sustenance. So, you don't want to eat something that God said is forbidden to eat, and you want to eat that which will produce the best possible health, not just because you physically desire it, because it has no connection to God whatsoever. And you want to prepare your body, your mind, your circumstances, so as to be able to do the mitzvahs that you have to do. So the need that you have is to get out of the world what's necessary to do mitzvahs. So at this point, you have two categories of activity, and one is clearly subservient to the other. There's doing mitzvahs and doing what's necessary to do mitzvahs. Now, Our view on what's necessary to do mitzvahs is very broad. What about rest and recreation? Well, one of the conditions of doing mitzvahs in the best possible way is your mental set. That includes your emotions. A person who's nervous, worried, lacking in self-confidence or self-esteem, a person who is bitter, depressed, his mitzvahs will not be done in the best possible way. So whatever is necessary to improve his mental and emotional, if that's different or included, state is also part of what's necessary for doing a mitzvah. And that might include playing tennis, or going fishing, or reading history, or going for a walk in the forest. All of that might be necessary. Our sources talk about physical pleasure as a necessary ingredient in producing the state of mind that is ideal for serving God. So all of these activities will now be correct. They'll be correct because that is the appropriate application of dealing with the physical world, obtaining from it necessities, which doesn't mean things, it can mean experiences. Obtaining from it the necessities to maximize one's service of God. But now, Ramchal pushes a step further and says, that a person who uses the world in this way, even when he's acting to provide his necessities, will acquire perfection thereby. Now that sounds like a bold step, because the mitzvahs are supposed to be the prescribed activities by which you provide perfection. These are the means to perfection that God dictated for us on the basis of the fact that he took into account the totality of our nature and our circumstances, and only he who is the creator could know all of that. So that would apply to mitzvahs directly, but here it seems like you have another category which isn't mitzvah and yet would have the same result. But the Ramchal takes it back, because he says that we have a mitzvah to take care of our physical necessities also. That's also a mitzvah. So it comes out that in the end, everything is mitzvah. Only mitzvahs have different kinds of prescriptions, different kinds of activities that they apply to. Sometimes the mitzvah says, this is what I want you to do. And sometimes the mitzvah says, this is what I want you to accomplish. But I'm not telling you how to do it. I want you to act so as to achieve a certain end, but the way in which you will achieve that end will vary from person to person and time to time. And therefore there can't be specific directions as to how to do it. Only you have to know that when you work for the sake of that end, you are also performing a mitzvah, and therefore it has the same status as the other mitzvahs that you do. It's something that will produce perfection, and something that you, by doing it, you're serving God. So it comes out, I'll take a question to say, I don't want to draw out the conclusion here, because I think this conclusion is unfamiliar to many people. It means that there could be a mitzvah to play tennis. You see, people grow up with an attitude, well, life has lots of things in it, and religion could be one of them if you so decide, and then your life will have employment and family life and recreation and religion. You know, maybe an hour in the morning when you daven and put on leather straps and boxes, and Sabbath observance, but then there's fishing and, taking a vacation in China and so forth and so on, and there are lots and lots of things to do. It comes out, according to this picture, that religion is everything. Religion is everything. Not by going off and living in the hills, in a cave, and doing nothing else, but because religion encompasses everything. The Torah encompasses all of the activities that you do. And the slight surprise in the Ramchal is that not only does the Torah system acknowledge these activities, the Torah system calls it mitzvah, which means you end up with 24/7, 365, living in terms of mitzvah. Those words the Rambam doesn't say. Maybe they're implied. I haven't been able to make up my mind. But those words the Rambam doesn't say. I suppose because the Ramchal follows the Rambam so often, he probably saw that as implied, and that's why he says it. Your question?
You just answered it.
I did, okay. Yeah.
So the word there, the Ramchal is using for perfection is shlemut? That's the word he uses?
Yes. Hebrew is a very impoverished language. Hebrew has an extremely small vocabulary. One reason is because for 2,000 years or more it wasn't spoken. So, of course, in the last 100 years, Hebrew has been enriched with all sorts of new Hebrew words like telephone and encyclopedia and so on. Ben Yehuda tried to avoid that. He created Hebrew phrases for those things, but they didn't catch. Telephone is sachrachok, which means speak from afar. No, that didn't mean, shmartaf. Shmartaf is what in Hebrew they call babysitter. You even have back axle, which is the axle of a car, when our cars used to have axles. And then there was a back axle hakidmi, the front back axle. Or plover. Plover is a pullover, a sweater. You have all these creative words. So Hebrew has a very small vocabulary, and therefore, when you have a large vocabulary and you look for Hebrew words, like in the medieval times from which this word comes, the word often doesn't carry the nuances of the English word. Perfection carries, shleimus just means completeness. He's not lacking anything. The opposite of shleimus is chesronot, which are lacks or deficiencies. Perfection in English is a much richer concept. But that's what's translated here because the way it's used corresponds to a certain extent to the idea of perfection. But you're right. The word in the Hebrew is shleimus. Shleimuyos means perfections in the plural. Okay? Okay. So, if you understand a lifetime of being in connection with God, then the first picture that many people have is very hard to sustain. You're religiously occupied in the synagogue for an hour in the morning and on Shabbos and on holidays and so on, and the rest of the time you're not religiously occupied. Well, if you're not religiously occupied, what exactly is the connection with God? According to Ramchal, this comes out very strong because you're doing mitzvah all the time. And mitzvah, it's very interesting. Chazal take the word mitzvah and they look at the two middle letters, Tzadi Vav. Tzadi Vav in Hebrew can mean connection. Tzavta is like a partnership or a friendship. So a mitzvah is something that creates a connection. I've known that for decades. I was listening to my wife, who's a famous Rebbitzin, giving a shir. She was preparing. It was a year ago, just before Shavuos, giving a shir on Zoom to people all over the world. And she said, we're coming to the 10 pronouncements of Sinai, the commandments. When you hear the word commandment, what do you think of? So I thought, what do I think of? Well, I think of right and wrong, good and evil, obedience and disobedience, authority and power and citizenship and so on and so on. That's what I think of. She said to the audience, you should think of relationship. I thought, oh my, I never would have thought of that. Relationship? Yeah, but it is a relationship. If he commands me, there's a connection. He's interested in me. What I do is important to him. Otherwise, he would ignore me. No, he's commanding me. Think of it in terms of a relationship. So, and then you have to ask, what are his purposes in commanding me? Is he lacking something he needs and I'm providing it for him? Probably not, right? So, what's the purpose of the command? What kind of relationship does it imply? So I learned a great deal from her. And this was really turned me around in thinking. So the idea of mitzvah here means you're in relationship with God the whole time. Then, when the Shulchan Aruch says, "Shivisi Hashem Nesegdi Somid," I place God before me continuously, it's not hard to understand because you're always doing mitzvah. And mitzvah is that essential connection. Yeah.
I was going to ask, according to your wife's interpretation, does that mean that we're constantly perfecting ourselves by doing things like any mitzvah, like the 10 Commandments? They're the main parts of our tradition, I think, in terms of like the commandments.
Now he stepped off over the line. He stepped over the line. Every mitzvah has infinite importance. We don't say that they're the main parts of the tradition. There used to be a custom, maybe 2,000 years ago or more, every day to recite the 10. I have to call them 10 pronouncements. The word 10 commandments is wrong.
Right.
There are 14 or 15 commandments there. It's just not 10 commandments, period. I don't care if it says it in the blue book. The blue book is copying common parlance, but it's not halakhically correct. It's the 10 pronouncements at Sinai. In the book itself, it calls it Aseres HaDevorim, which means 10 statements. And in rabbinic literature, it's Aseres HaDibros, which means 10 pronouncements. Nowhere is it ever called the 10 commandments, except in English literature, where it's a mistake. The 10 pronouncements of Sinai aren't any holier. They aren't any more important as the 10 pronouncements than any other place in the Torah. In fact, although there are some people who have the custom, we do, when you come to read that portion in the Torah, in the synagogue on Saturday, right? You stand up, but many people don't, because they don't want to give the impression that this is more important than other things. It was very, very careful not any holier than Achos Lotan Timna. That Lotan, some non-Jew, had a sister named Timna that's just as holy as the 10 pronouncements. All equally holy. Yeah, the Rambam in the guide talks about this in detail. And he gives examples of what it has to teach us. It's all equally holy. That's extremely important. Okay, so now, so he says every action you do, you are elevated thereby, you're spiritualized thereby, and that all of it serves as constitutes serving God. Then he talks briefly here about Ava and Yira. He has a whole chapter on it later in the Sefer. I'm not going to go into what he says here because it's very ethereal. The 9th paragraph, he introduces a subject which is a very widely discussed subject. I'm going to give you some background to it. I think there's a gigantic puzzle here. And I think that what he writes here solves the puzzle, but it is, how shall I say, it's using high-powered esoteric machinery to solve the problem. If you have a taste for economy, you'd like to use as little machinery as possible and as common everyday machinery as possible. And if you have to go deep into the Kabbalah to solve this problem, either you're missing something, or what you have is a discussion which really is built on the Kabbalah, which is not mentioned in the discussion. That's very important to me because I think it's a hint that there's something more going on than you see on the surface. Anyway, this discussion starts by dividing commandments into 2 parts. One part is the study of Torah, and the other part is everything else. If there are 613 basic commandments, it's 1 versus 612. Now, the Mishnah Pirkei Avos, the Gemara Kedushin, discuss the question of which is more important. How is the importance of the 2 of them related to one another? And there are various statements about this comparison. For example, the Gemara in Kedushin says that Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Tarfon disagreed as to which is greater, the study of Torah or the performance of the commandments. And the Gemara goes on that the assembled company who were party to the discussion gave their opinion, and they said, great is study because it brings you to performance. Now that's a bit challenging. Let's see now. Let's try this again. Which is bigger, A or B? So one says A and one says B and one says B. And the other ones, and the assembled company says, A is big because it brings you to B. Really? Does that answer the question? The question was, which is bigger, A or B? So you start off by saying A is big, you hear, okay. He's saying A is bigger, right. And then he says, it's big because it brings you to B. Oh, really? So then, which is bigger? Which is bigger? Like, what was the answer? Right? A Talmud is like that. So Rashi says, just a few words there. Nimsa shnehem biyado. And that means if, the words mean in the end you'll have both. So one of the commentators explains Rashi as follows. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon are discussing which is bigger. Why would you discuss that? What would be your purpose in analyzing that? The only time you need to discover which is bigger of A and B is when you could only have one, so you know what to go after. But suppose I have a strategy for getting both. If I have a strategy for getting both, then your discussion about which is bigger is purely academic. It might be important for philosophy and analysis, but practically speaking, we know exactly what to do. Talmud is great in practical terms because the study of Torah will bring you to performance and then you'll have both. So the assembled company is rejecting the analysis, rejecting the problematic that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon are discussing. That's what happens in Gemara and Kedushin. Those who study Talmud know that at the end of the first chapter of Bava Kama, the Gemara reintroduces the question, and Machlokes over there, Rashi and Tosfos, which is greater in general. But you see that from the point of view of the assembled company, the question becomes a purely theoretical question. Because practically speaking, invest in study, and it'll bring you to the condition where you have both. Okay, so now I want to take a step back and ask, where's the question coming from? Look, you have 613 commandments. They're all commandments. The study of Torah is also a commandment. Why would you isolate it? What motivates setting study to one side and all the other commandments to the other side? How about matzah? Take matzah. There's a commandment to eat matzah and all the other commandments. Which is greater? What's more important? Eating matzah? You wouldn't start like that. There are 613 things that you have to do. Each one of them is a mitzvah, and there's lots of them. What motivates putting one on one side and the other on the other side? It's really not obvious. Now, here's another statement which you have in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Someone whose wisdom is greater than his performance, his wisdom will not last. Someone whose performance is greater than his wisdom will last. Let's see. So somehow, carrying out what you know is a crucial element of preserving the wisdom, preserving it. Without carrying it out, you won't have it. So again, to set up the contrast, what's greater, study or performance? What you're being told is your study won't succeed without the performance. So how do you justify the division? And by the way, Ben Yonah asks in his Shari Tshuva, what is the Mishnah telling me? If my wisdom is greater than my performance, I understand that. I've learned a lot, but I don't carry it all out. I don't do it at all. But how could your performance be greater than your wisdom? How can you do what you don't know? Listen to his answer. His answer is astonishing. He says, you sit down to read a book. This book has Jewish laws in it. What's your attitude? Why are you reading the book? If your attitude is, I want to know how to serve my Creator, and this book has information in it, and that's why I'm reading it, says Rabbi Yonah, you get credit for doing everything in the book before you do it. That's Maisa. That's the action. The action is the credit you get for the actions that you haven't done yet. And that's how your actions could outrun your wisdom. But you see that now wisdom, which you get from study, is dependent upon action. So how do you set up this criterion that there's wisdom, there's study on one side and action on the other side, and you want to know which is greater? The problematic, as we say, is not obvious. Why it is that it should be set up that way. Then there's another thing. What about studying things that for you aren't practical? I'm not a Kohen. What about my studying the laws of Kohanim? Well, the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is to study Torah, whether it's practical or not. Even so far as You probably have heard of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, many disputes that they had. In the end, the rule was set up that we decide the law according to Beis Hillel. That rule is so absolute that the Gemara comments, Beis Shammai Eina Mishnah. When you are talking about the contents of the Mishnah, in a certain sense, Beis Shammai doesn't count. Doesn't count. We don't use their opinion in practical terms, and as far as its force is concerned, it has less force than any other disagreement. Now what happens? A person gets up in the morning, and he makes the blessings on studying Torah, and he spends the whole day studying Beis Shammai. Just Beis Shammai. That's all he does. Has he studied Torah? Maybe the blessing on the study of Torah was a blessing in vain, because he didn't really study Torah? No, he studied Torah. It's not practical because we don't follow it, and it doesn't even have the status of a competitor for practice. Yeah, but it's Torah. It's included in the holy books, and if you study it, you get credit for studying Torah. So studying Torah now, it applies in a way that outruns practice in principle. So now, it's beginning to sound like apples and oranges. If you're talking about studying this mitzvah or doing this mitzvah, at least you're on the same plane. You're talking about the same subject. You're talking about one aspect of it or another aspect of it. But now you're talking about studying something which has no application in practice at all. That would make it sound like it's going to be impossible to compare them altogether. So this is the trouble that I still have, in understanding where the question comes from. Now when we see, at the beginning of next week, we'll see how the Ramchal describes the difference between the two of them. We'll see that in a deep Kabbalistic way, there is a fundamental difference between the two. And then the question can be asked and can be answered. But without the Kabbalistic apparatus, I find it very difficult to explain the discussion. I've asked this of scholars. Explain to me where it's coming from. Explain to me what the intellectual basis is for these comparisons and these evaluations. I have not gotten an answer that I could understand. Now I'm mentioning this in part even for the recording. Ask other people. Ask people that I don't know, and see if you come up with something. I'll be very happy to hear it. But in the meantime, that's what we'll pick up with in the beginning next week.